Kash Patel called Denzel Washington a thug on live TV, thinking it would humiliate him. But within minutes, the entire room fell silent, because what Denzel said next stunned everyone. By the end, one man had been exposed, and the other walked out stronger. Don't scroll. This is the moment they didn't want you to see. No one expected it to turn into a public reckoning, but that's exactly what happened the moment Kash Patel leaned into his microphone and called Denzel Washington, a guest speaker at the congressional hearing, a thug in a suit. Cameras were rolling, reporters were typing, and the chamber fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence. The hearing was supposed to be routine. Another day, another partisan panel. Patel had just finished a fiery monologue about celebrity activists meddling in politics. Then, without warning, he turned directly to Denzel with a smirk full of contempt. "You, Mr. Washington," he sneered, "have become nothing more than a thug in a suit." The temperature in the room dropped. Even a few on Patel's side looked visibly uncomfortable. The tension was electric. Everyone expected Denzel to clap back with fury or sarcasm, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't even blink. Instead, Denzel leaned forward, gently tapped the microphone, and said a single word. "Interesting." And that's when everything shifted. "I've been called worse," Denzel said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "But I'll tell you what I haven't been called: out of touch. Not by the people back in South Central or Detroit or Newark, folks who write me every week asking why Washington feels more like a movie set than a place that's supposed to serve real people." He paused. The camera zoomed in. The air was tight. "I got a letter just last week from a single mother named Carla," he continued. "She works 2 jobs and still can't afford basic insulin for her daughter. You want to talk about thugs? Try letting kids go without medicine while you pose for magazine covers and lecture the country on values." A few panel members shifted in their seats. Patel looked caught off guard, his mouth opening slightly as Denzel continued. "It's easy to sit up here and treat this like a talk show audition," Denzel said. "But I didn't come here to entertain. I came to speak for people whose voices never make it to these halls." He pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from his folder. "This is a letter, handwritten, from an 11-year-old girl in Chicago. She asked me why the people who make the rules live so differently than the rest of us. That hit me, Mr. Patel, because I didn't have an answer." Silence. No interruptions, no interjections. Denzel folded the letter and placed it carefully on the desk. Then he looked straight at Patel. "I may be a lot of things, but I'm not someone who forgot who he's supposed to fight for." The reaction online was immediate. The clip went viral within minutes. Hashtags exploded. Political analysts scrambled to catch up. And as Patel leaned back in his chair, clearly rattled, the internet had already reached its verdict. Denzel hadn't just responded. He had turned the insult into a mirror, forcing Patel to look straight into it. And this was only the beginning. After Denzel's calm but cutting response, the room still hadn't recovered. The committee chair, clearly shaken, tried to move on, but no one was paying attention. All eyes were still on Denzel. A few glanced nervously at Patel, waiting to see if he'd try to answer. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his glasses, and forced a smile that didn't quite land. Then, in a low voice cracking with defensiveness, Patel muttered, "I won't apologize for calling out extremism. Mr. Washington knows exactly what he's doing, feeding red meat to angry crowds. That's not leadership. That's manipulation." But the damage was already done. "That's not leadership. That's manipulation." A quiet gasp rippled through the room, not because of what Patel said, but when he said it. He had just insulted the very people Denzel spoke about. The struggling mother, the 11-year-old girl with a handwritten letter, the everyday Americans whose stories never made it into headlines. Denzel's response didn't come fast, but when it did, it landed harder than before. "You just called the American people angry and manipulated," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "Is that where we are now? You sit in a city with the highest homelessness rate in the country, and you haven't fixed a single thing." He didn't shout, he didn't even raise his hand. "But sure," Denzel added, "go ahead, lecture us all from the moral high ground." The silence gave way to low murmurs. "You want to talk about manipulation?" he continued, You promised your constituents transparency, but you've buried more documents than you've ever released. He never once raised his voice. He didn't point. He didn't posture. And that's what made it so unsettling. It wasn't performance. It was real, raw, honest. Patel leaned back, tapping a pen nervously against the desk. For the first time, he looked unsure. He glanced at his aides behind him, but they had nothing, just tense expressions and quiet panic. Denzel pressed further. People where I come from don't care about political theater. They care about whether they can afford to fill their tank. They care if fentanyl is going to reach their child's school. They care about why everything costs more while you and your friends fly private jets to climate summits. The room went quiet again. More than quiet. It was unsettled. Even senators who had been seated firmly in Patel's corner now looked uneasy, unsure of whose side they were supposed to be on. It wasn't personal anymore. Denzel had shifted the entire narrative. What had started as a petty insult had morphed into something far deeper and far more uncomfortable. Outside the hearing room, news anchors were scrambling. Breaking banners hit screens. Denzel flips the script on Patel. Patel's attack backfires live. Within 30 minutes, the clip had 500,000 views. Comment sections exploded. This is how you answer an insult. With truth. Finally, someone said it. Inside, the next speaker was called, but no one was listening. Patel had lit a fire, and now it was burning out of his control. Down the hallway, reporters gathered around the doors before the session even ended. Everyone wanted a comment, a soundbite, a headline. But neither Denzel nor Patel stepped out. Not yet. Inside the chamber, the tension lingered. Denzel calmly collected a few pages from his folder and handed them to a clerk. He leaned back in his seat, quiet, as if he were finished. But then, a few seconds later, he raised his hand. Just one more thing, he said. The entire room froze. Even the chair didn't object. Patel turned slightly, but avoided eye contact. Denzel stood and held up a printed page. This is a city council report from Los Angeles County, he said. It says 75,000 people are homeless. That's more than the population of some entire towns in my state, and those numbers rise every year. He let that number hang in the air. And yet, he continued, we're told this is leadership. This is progress. This is how things are supposed to work. He set the paper gently on the desk. People back home are watching this. They hear you calling me names, but they never hear you explaining how this circus helps them live a better life. Again, the silence was deafening. A few members shifted uncomfortably. Not out of political discomfort this time, but out of reflection. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was reflection. Denzel had pulled the conversation back to its core, what government is supposed to do and who it's supposed to serve. Kash Patel, visibly frustrated, tried to seize control again. Well, maybe if you and your crowd spent less time grandstanding and more time negotiating in good faith. But Denzel cut in, still calm, still composed. Negotiating with who? The bureaucrats? The unelected advisors? The lobbyists you meet behind closed doors? That's not negotiation. That's theater. That line landed like a punch without ever raising a fist. You call me a thug because I speak directly to people, because I won't sit silently while this place sinks under its own weight. But you want to know what I really am? He paused. I'm inconvenient, that's all. Then Denzel slowly gathered his folder and stood. I don't wear a halo, Mr. Pine, but I walk into every diner, every high school, every community center in my state and look people in the eye. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Finally, the chair spoke, barely above a whisper. We're going to recess for 10 minutes. But no one moved. Not at first. Denzel walked out quietly through the chamber doors and into a swarm of reporters. Microphones surged toward him, but he raised his hand. I'll speak in a bit, he said. Let the room breathe first. Back inside, Patel remained frozen in his seat, staring down at the table. The insult he thought would land a headline had become the most watched political moment of the week, maybe the year. Outside, media coverage exploded. Cable anchors cut into scheduled programming. Breaking headlines raced across the screen. Denzel holds up handwritten letter. I didn't have an answer. It wasn't Denzel's charisma that unraveled Patel, it was his vulnerability, and the people felt that. Meanwhile, Patel huddled with two aides in the corner of the chamber. He looked shaken, nervously scrolling through his tablet. His name was trending, but for all the wrong reasons. Don't say anything more, one aide whispered. Let it pass. But he wasn't listening. In a flash of impulse, Patel stood and walked toward the press doors. The hearing was still technically in recess, but reporters parted like the Red Sea. I stand by what I said, Patel began, forcing a smile. I don't apologize for defending democracy from those who cheapen it with culture wars and inflammatory rhetoric. But then came the follow-up. Do you think calling Denzel Washington a thug helps defend democracy? He froze for a beat. The smirk disappeared. Well, I think sometimes people need to be called out when they're acting out of line. It was weak, defensive. Too late. Reporters sensed blood in the water. Worse, the public wasn't siding with him. Because while Patel scrambled to reclaim the narrative, Denzel wasn't even trying. He was out in the hallway, walking through the crowd, not avoiding it. He shook hands with janitors, interns, staffers, people who never make the nightly news, but whose lives are shaped by what happens inside those rooms. And someone caught it on camera. By the time Denzel stepped up to the podium, the video was already viral. Captioned, Denzel doesn't talk down, he walks with them. He adjusted the microphone with the same quiet strength he'd shown in the hearing. I didn't come here today to argue, but, he began, I came to speak for the people who are usually ignored. I've got no time to waste trading insults with career politicians who forgot what this place is supposed to be. Then Denzel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small note card. This is something I carry with me, he said, holding it up. It's a quote from my grandfather. It says, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. I try to live by that. The crowd of reporters didn't interrupt. They listened. And Denzel continued, I'm not going to return personal attacks, but I'll keep telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Applause broke out, not from political allies or party loyalists, but from reporters, staffers, even a few tourists standing near the entrance. As Denzel turned to walk away, a voice rang out from the crowd. Do you consider Mr. Patel a friend? Denzel paused only for a second. I consider him a reminder. Then he walked off. By mid-afternoon, the confrontation had gone fully viral. News networks ran back-to-back segments. YouTubers, podcasters, and commentators on both sides couldn't stop talking about it. But all the momentum was on Denzel's side. Clips of Patel's insults circulated, but they were always shown with Denzel's calm, devastating response. The contrast was unmistakable. One man looked petty, the other looked composed and grounded. Back at the Capitol, Denzel's office phone rang nonstop. Messages poured in, calls from constituents, fellow public figures, even a few Democrats who quietly admitted that Patel had crossed a line. Inside Patel's office, the mood was entirely different. His team scrambled. One aide suggested posting a clarification. Another warned it might make things worse. Every option felt like a trap. That's when Patel made a decision, not to call a strategist, but a cable news producer. He wanted to go live. He thought he could fix it. That evening, Kash Patel sat across from a familiar anchor in a cold, sterile studio. The lights were harsh. The smile was forced. Mr. Patel, you called Denzel Washington a thug today. Live on national television. Do you regret that word? Patel took a breath, deflecting. I regret that the conversation shifted from real issues to personal drama. My intention was to highlight behavior, not attack character. But the anchor pressed again. Would you use that word again? A pause, a crack. Maybe not that word, Patel admitted, but the sentiment stands. That one line was clipped, captioned, and uploaded before the interview had even ended. And the internet did not like it. It didn't sound like strength. It sounded like pride, coded backtracking. Meanwhile, Denzel was already back home for the weekend. He wasn't hiding. He was hosting a town hall. Hundreds showed up, more than expected. Folding chairs were added last minute. The energy in the room wasn't political, it was personal. This was no longer about points on a scoreboard, it was about trust, and Denzel had earned it. During the Q&A, a woman stood up. Her voice wavered slightly. "What happened in D.C.? How did you handle it so calmly?" Denzel nodded. "I didn't plan to be in a viral video," he said. "I planned to tell the truth, and sometimes the truth stings people who aren't used to hearing it." The crowd clapped, not wild applause, but something deeper, sincere. Then a teenager in the back raised his hand, his voice cracked. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" Denzel looked right at him. "All the time," he said, "but I never get tired of defending folks who can't fight back. That's what keeps me going." That 14-second clip was posted that night. By the next morning, it had over 4 million views. Patel had tried to win the moment with a headline, but Denzel, he won it with a handwritten letter, a note card in his pocket, and the quiet, unshakable power of listening. And now the nation wasn't just watching, it was remembering. The nation was remembering. By Monday morning, the conversation had shifted. What started as a petty insult during a congressional hearing had grown into something much bigger. Something personal for millions of Americans who had felt overlooked for far too long. Every major outlet was dissecting the fallout, but this time it wasn't about who won the exchange. It was about what had been revealed. Editorials asked the question out loud: is Washington out of touch? Denzel strikes a chord while Patel misses the moment. Even commentators who typically leaned left admitted that Patel's attack had backfired badly. One journalist summed it up simply: "You don't call a man a thug for reading a letter from an 11-year-old girl. You just don't." But Denzel wasn't focused on the headlines. He was focused on the follow-through. Back in his home office, his team was working through hundreds of messages that had poured in. Voicemails from retired veterans, emails from single parents, handwritten letters from small towns that most lawmakers couldn't find on a map. And then there was the call. It came in quietly. A staffer answered. On the other end was Carla, the single mother Denzel had mentioned during the hearing. She didn't expect to speak to him, just wanted to say thank you. But Denzel came to the phone. She was crying. "I didn't think anyone up there even knew people like me existed," she said. "But when you read my letter, you made me feel seen." Denzel didn't say much, he just listened. When she finished, he replied with something simple: "You're why I ran." That afternoon, Denzel's team posted a message. No graphics, no logo, just white text on a black background. Leadership isn't loud, it's listening, and it starts by remembering who you work for. By midnight, it had been shared over 1 million times. Back in Washington, Kash Patel's office was silent. The press had stopped calling. The cameras had moved on, and behind closed doors, frustration was mounting. Every attempt to redirect the narrative had failed. They couldn't spin this, because this wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about authenticity. Denzel hadn't delivered a performance. He had delivered a message. While Patel buried himself in accusations and carefully rehearsed talking points, Denzel had cut through the noise, and it resonated across party lines. That's what made it sting. Patel hadn't just lost an argument, he'd lost the crowd. And deep down, he knew it. As the week continued, Denzel returned quietly to the Capitol. No press team, no entourage, no spotlight. But this time, even his critics couldn't ignore him. He wasn't just a public figure anymore. He was the man who reminded Washington what it had forgotten. The ripple effect was immediate. At the next hearing, one that wasn't even televised, the energy had shifted. Colleagues who once passed him in silence now nodded in quiet respect. Staffers from across the aisle glanced over, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Patel wasn't there. His team said he was reconsidering public appearances. But those close to him knew the truth. He was still regrouping, unsure of how to walk back into a room that had already moved on without him. Meanwhile, Denzel wasn't wasting time. During that hearing, at the very next session, Denzel Washington introduced a motion. It was simple, practical, and targeted: to reallocate unused federal administrative funds toward a nationwide pilot program for affordable insulin access. And it didn't come with slogans, it came with letters from real people. Carla's letter was one of them. Denzel didn't mention Kash Patel. He didn't have to. The contrast was doing all the talking. While Patel was drafting new statements and monitoring approval polls, Denzel was doing what most Americans had stopped expecting from their representatives. He was delivering results. Back in his home state, Denzel's approval numbers spiked, not just among progressives, but independents, even some conservatives. Not because they suddenly agreed with him on every issue, but because he had done what few public figures ever manage. He made them feel heard. Meanwhile, the political media kept trying to stir the pot. They wanted a rematch. They begged Denzel to respond further. They baited him to extend the feud. But he never bit. During a short interview outside the Capitol, a reporter asked him directly, "Mr. Washington, would you consider Kash Patel your political enemy?" Denzel paused, shook his head slowly. "No, just someone who forgot who he works for." And then he walked away. That sentence, calm, direct, and piercing, was played over and over on evening news. It wasn't anger, it wasn't mockery, it was disappointment. And somehow that made it worse for Patel. Because the story had moved on from a single insult. It had become a case study in leadership when the cameras stopped rolling. Patel had thrown the first punch. But Denzel hadn't thrown one back. He redirected it, used it, transformed it into something powerful. And voters noticed, on social media, a phrase began to take root. "Do it the Denzel way." It became a quiet rebellion. A comment under town hall clips. A reply to performative politics. A warning shot aimed directly at the establishment and Patel. Behind closed doors, Patel's team was in panic mode. The internal numbers weren't just bad, they were brutal. His favorability was sinking, especially among moderates. Major donors had gone silent. Interview requests had dried up. A high-profile fundraiser in San Francisco had been postponed twice. And the infamous clip, calling Denzel a thug, was still circulating. But now it was being used against him in early campaign ads. And worst of all, Denzel wasn't even playing. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't tweeting. He wasn't throwing counterpunches. He was just moving forward. Quiet, steady, effective. And that silence was deafening. Because in politics, there's nothing more dangerous than an opponent who refuses to play your game. Meanwhile, Denzel's insulin proposal was gaining bipartisan momentum. 3 senators from across the aisle had already signed on. More were expected. Analysts called it shockingly practical. But Denzel didn't care about headlines. He never walked into meetings with cameras or handlers. Just a folder filled with letters, people's stories. He brought them every time. And every time it worked. Even longtime skeptics began to admit it. The man who once spoke in sharp metaphors and Hollywood cadence had become one of the most respected and effective voices in the room. He wasn't grandstanding, he was governing. And it made Patel's earlier insult look even more hollow. Eventually, Patel tried to pivot. He posted a long Twitter thread warning about the dangers of populist rhetoric and how it supposedly threatened democratic norms. But no one engaged. The replies were flooded with a single phrase: "Do it the Denzel way." He tried again, this time with a highly produced video, polished lighting, teleprompters, background music, carefully edited pauses. It disappeared into the void within hours, because authenticity can't be edited in post-production. Meanwhile, Denzel's team posted a 43-second clip. No studio, no lights, no filter, just him sitting on a folding chair in a high school gym in rural Mississippi answering questions from a group of teenagers. One kid asked, "What do you think politicians get wrong the most?" Denzel smiled. "They talk too much and listen too little." The clip got over 6 million views in 2 days, and slowly the national conversation began to shift. Cable shows started comparing Denzel's style to old-school public servants, the kind who didn't rise by shouting, but by understanding. And voters? They were paying attention, not just in California or Louisiana, but across the country. Because while Patel scrambled to rebuild his image, Denzel was building something stronger: trust. And in Washington, trust is currency. By the end of the week, Denzel's insulin bill was scheduled for committee debate. And as votes quietly lined up behind the scenes, something became clear. The man Patel tried to humiliate was now leading the most talked about bipartisan effort in months, and he had done it without shouting once. The Senate chamber was unusually full that day. Staffers, journalists, even members of the public filtered in, quietly taking their seats. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This was a test of leadership, of integrity, of who the Senate would still choose to follow. Denzel sat near the front. No press team, no swarm of cameras, just his jacket, same note cards still tucked inside, and a single folder of letters. Some from Louisiana, some from places he'd never even visited. One from a woman in Oregon, another from a retired nurse in Ohio. They all said the same thing. Thank you for listening. When his name was called, Denzel stood and walked slowly to the podium. For a moment, the room went completely still. This isn't a Republican idea, and it's not a Democrat idea, he began. It's just an American idea, that people shouldn't have to choose between food and medicine. He placed a letter on the podium. This one's from a dad in Iowa, lost his wife last year, now raising 2 kids alone. His boy is diabetic. And guess what? He can't afford insulin. Not because it doesn't exist, but because this town forgot what it was like to struggle. No shouting, no finger pointing, just truth. While some folks up here worry about sound bites and cable hits, Denzel continued, I'm worried about whether the next generation will believe this place ever mattered at all. A few senators lowered their eyes. The bill passed through committee that day with unexpected ease. Even those who had once doubted him now nodded in quiet agreement. The vote wasn't close. When asked why the bill received such overwhelming support, one senator gave a surprising answer. Because Denzel reminded us why we're here. And just like that, the man Kash Patel once tried to label a thug had done what few in modern politics managed to do. He bridged a divide, not with volume, but with humanity. Meanwhile, Patel was notably absent from the vote. Patel's office claimed a scheduling conflict, but no one believed it. The truth was, after weeks of backlash, headlines, and awkward silences, Kash Patel hadn't just lost an argument, he'd lost relevance. That same week, a political cartoon began circulating on social media. It showed Denzel Washington planting a flag in the middle of a bridge. Behind him, broken microphones, shattered headlines, and forgotten cameras. In the distance stood Patel shouting into the void, but no one was listening. Because in the end, Denzel didn't need to win a debate. He only needed to remind the country of something it had almost forgotten. Conviction doesn't have to come wrapped in anger, and respect doesn't come from titles. It comes from trust. Weeks passed, but the story kept echoing, not because of the insult, but because of what came after it. Denzel's insulin bill passed the full Senate with bipartisan support. It was signed into law 1 month later. The headlines didn't scream. They didn't need to. The victory spoke for itself. Families began reporting lower prices. Pharmacies updated signage. Parents in small towns across the country that finally breathed easier. And Denzel? He never took a victory lap. He simply said, "It's a start," and went back to work. But in Washington, everyone knew what had just happened. A single moment of public disrespect, meant to humiliate, had backfired so thoroughly it reshaped the public image of both men. Kash Patel, once seen as sharp and confident, now wore the label of arrogance. Denzel Washington, once dismissed as just another celebrity, had become one of the most grounded and effective voices in the country. Even political commentators were forced to reconsider. One podcast host put it best, Denzel didn't win because he clapped back. He won because he didn't. He stayed calm, he told the truth, and he showed us that you don't have to scream to be heard, you just have to care. Patel, still trying to salvage his standing, released a quiet statement, congratulating Denzel on the insulin bill. But it felt hollow, too late, too calculated. The public had already moved on. More importantly, they had already chosen who they believed. Back in the South, Denzel resumed his town hall tour. No cameras, no press alerts, just folding chairs, school gyms, community centers, and small businesses. And always, his same folder, his stack of letters, his reminders. People hugged him. Some cried, others just shook his hand and said, "Thank you for not forgetting us." At one quiet event outside Baton Rouge, a young girl walked up to him. She handed him a folded piece of notebook paper, edges torn, creased from being clutched. It read, "Thank you for reading my letter. You made me feel important. My mom said you gave us hope." Denzel smiled, gently folded the note, and placed it in his folder beside the others. Then he looked out at the small crowd. "Washington likes to pretend it's a stage," he said. "Oh, but I don't act. I serve, and I'll keep doing that until the day they show me the door." That line would never make the front page, but it didn't have to, because everyone in that room knew exactly what it meant. In the end, Kash Patel's insult didn't destroy Denzel Washington. It defined him, just not in the way Patel had ever intended.